Now, before we continue with the rest of these additional problems, I want to make sure that you understand how we find the derivatives of the 6 basic trigonometric functions. And we'll start with the derivative of sine of x. The derivatives of sine of x and cosine of x will be found using the limit definition of the derivative. So we'll have the limit as delta x approaches 0 of sine of x plus delta x minus sine of x and all over delta x. Now, in order to break this down further, you're going to need to remember a trigonometric identity for the sine of angle sums. And it goes like this. The sine of a sum of two angles is sine alpha cosine beta plus cosine alpha sine beta. Now, there are 14 or 16 trigonometric identities, but this is one that you will be required to remember throughout the course. Now, when we apply that trig identity to sine of x plus delta x, we get sine x cosine delta x plus cosine x sine of delta x. Then we still have the minus sine x in the numerator above. And that's all over delta x. In order to simplify this further now, we're going to take the sine x, the minus sine x, that's at the very end in the numerator, and we're going to move it behind the sine x cosine delta x. And that will allow us to factor out a sine of x from those two terms. So I'll do that in 2 steps. So we have sine of x cosine of delta x. Next, we're going to add in the minus sine of x. And then after that, we still have the plus cosine x sine of delta x. And all over delta x. As I said before, we're going to factor out a sine of x from the first 2 terms in the numerator. So we get sine of x times the quantity cosine delta x minus 1. And I'm going to form a new fraction here by putting this all over delta x by itself. Then I still have cosine of x sine of delta x with a positive. And I'll form a new fraction with that term also over delta x. At this point, you want to recall 2 important limits, trigonometric limits. And the first is the limit as x approaches 0 of sine x over x is 1. And we can see that limit on the fraction on the right. And the second trig limit that we want to remember is the limit as x approaches 0 of 1 minus cosine of x over delta x. And if I factor it out, and that is 0, by the way. Now, if I factor out a negative 1 from that numerator, I would get the limit as x approaches 0 of negative quantity cosine x minus 1 over x, and that would still be 0. So we can say then that the limit as x approaches 0 of cosine x minus 1 over x is 0, and we see that limit on the fraction on the left, and since that's going to have a negative sign with it, I will put the negative sign in front of the sine x, but we're going to see that that's not going to matter because that whole thing becomes 0. Cosine delta x minus 1 over delta x is 0, then the whole left fraction is 0, leaving you simply with the derivative of sine x is cosine of x. Now let's briefly step through the same procedure to find the derivative of cosine of x. We have the limit as delta x approaches 0 of cosine x plus delta x minus cosine of x over delta x. And you're going to need to remember another trigonometric identity here. Cosine of angle sum is cosine alpha cosine beta minus sine alpha sine beta. And we'll apply that to cosine x plus delta x. So we'll get cosine x cosine delta x minus sine delta x minus cosine of x, and all over delta x. We're going to move in the negative cosine x the same way we did above, leaving everything else the same. Then we'll factor out a cosine of x on the left and form 2 new fractions again. Once again, we can see our important trig limits. Cosine delta x minus 1 over delta x is 0, making the whole term on the left 0. Sine of delta x over delta x is 1, and leaving you with derivative of cosine of x is negative sine of x.